We're looking at Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilych today, and we'll be looking at it next class as well. So Tolstoy is a little bit of a departure from what we've been looking at recently, insofar as he's not only writing a novella, which we've not yet had. We will have more of them now, so short novels. But he's also Russian, as you probably know. Born in 1828, and to an aristocratic family, so he's Count Leo, and dies in, let me say here, 1910. Known for the famous work War and Peace, and also Anna Karenina. He's a really interesting figure in many ways. So he's born into a family estate, and he eventually moves to Moscow and so forth, and some of that probably plays into the backdrop of this little novella as well. This is Tolstoy is of debatable Christian affiliation. Some see him as a Christian writer, some will question that, and I'm not really concerned with his personal relationship to God per se in the novel. I don't think it's particularly important per se. He certainly uses religious themes, however, and the significance of a commitment to God is at the heart of the death of Ivan Ilych. And so it's an interesting story of death, and it's interesting because at the centerpiece of the Christian faith is not only the life of Jesus, but in particular the death of Jesus, about which the gospel accounts spend over half of their account. So it's an interesting thing when you talk about the Gospels. I'm not going to talk about that here in this class, but when I do the study of the Bible as literature and we come to the Gospels, one of the challenges is what sort of literature is this that we are confronting, because it seems biographical. It's about the birth, as the birth of Jesus at least. That's told in a few of the accounts, Matthew and Luke. And it goes to the end of Jesus' life, so that makes it a biography, but the majority of it, as I say, deal with the last week of Jesus' life, which is a pretty odd biography. You'll never read another biography that's dealing with the death of its subject of interest. But that's, as I say, slightly off topic, but only slightly, because for Tolstoy in the person of Ivan Ilych, it really is about the death of the figure. So the death has a significance for the life of the character that I would say has an analogy, at any rate, with Christian understanding. So if you read a biography to this day, even a Christian biography, it will talk about the birth and the early upbringing and all sorts of things, and then various episodes, and it will end with the character's death. And it doesn't go on much after that. That's more or less the end of it, because there's nothing more to say. That's not the case in Jesus' life either, so it's not really a biography. In Tolstoy's case, he begins with the death of this main character. He's already dead. And then we find out, based on the response to people to his death, a lot about the society in which he lives. And there's a sort of a telescoping narrative style, which will talk about the significance of death in the meaning of a person's life. And I find that very interesting. The whole narrative perspective and the emphasis on the importance of death is really, really interesting, and seems like quite a departure from the Enlightenment. Which it is also, I think. It is a departure, and in some sense a rejection of the Enlightenment and the myth of progress. So for that reason, I think Tolstoy, just like Dostoevsky, who I prefer, is a much richer, more profound writer. And Russian writers in general, I think, they're much more to my taste at any rate. And I think that tends to be most people's experience. But I don't want to speak on behalf of most people. But so The Death of Ivan Ilych is the title of the work, and it begins, and there are 10 chapters in it. And in those 10 chapters, we get this, what the beginning, the first chapter is more or less the fulcrum around which the rest of the novel revolves. So we begin inside the great building of the law courts. During the interval in the hearing of the Malvinsky case, wherein the members of the Judicial Council and the public prosecutor were gathered together in the private room of Ivan Yegorovich Shebek, and the conversation turned upon the celebrated Krasovsky case. Fyodor Vasilievich hotly maintained that the case was not in the jurisdiction of the court. Yegor Ivanovich stood up for his own view. But from the first, Fyodor Ivanovich, who had not entered into the discussion, took no interest in it, but was looking through the newspapers which had just been brought in. "Gentlemen," he said, "Ivan Ilych is dead." "You don't say so. Here, read it." So then they read about the death of this figure. Now, what's interesting about it is we learn about the life of the man in part from the response of those who were related to him and are responding to it, in the same way that in the gospel accounts, when Jesus dies, we're told about what the bystanders think. There are those who crucify them. There's the Roman centurion. There's Mary and the other women who've come to see him die. There's the response of the disciples. There are all sorts of different responses, and the responses tell us something about the nature of the death and its significance and its meaning. So that's in that sense, he seems to have picked up some of the narrative devices that the Bible itself uses. I find that interesting again. And there is one thing that Tolstoy is: he is a brilliant novelist. There's no doubt about it. And it's partly because he discloses character through plot and through dialogue. But you also note here, and this is interesting, we're getting a lot of narrative here. Now, as I say, we're for the first time dealing with a novel or a novella, and so there is a lot of filler, and when I say filler, it gives us context in a way that we didn't notice in the poetry. A lot more context. So just as I've said, the law courts, it's when it happens, it talks about who's there, and then we get these interspersions, like here, "Gentlemen, he is dead." So this is direct speech. And then it begs the question of what type of story is this and how is it written? Now, you probably from school would know something about narrative devices. So what is the perspective here that we are given in this story, by the way? If I asked you that question, would you know what I was after even? Okay, so then what is the narrative perspective here? Who is the narrator? Do we trust him? In what person is it written? All of those things are germane here, and they have an effect on the credibility of the story and how we receive it. So that's the question then. What is the narrative perspective, first of all? Sure.
It's written in the third person.
Yeah.
And it seems to be an omniscient narrator.
Omniscient narrator. Certainly a third person, there's no disputing that. So it's not written from I, it's just told. Do we have any reason to doubt that the narrative perspective is unreliable? I don't think so. There's no reason for doubting that it's happening. So it purports to be an objective account. If we were in the room beside them, we would notice all the things that were being told in the story. There may be other things, but we're not going to disagree with what's been said. And the selection of the details is going to be important then. Is it the author's own viewpoint? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And we will, so that one way in which narrators or authors can show their disagreement with the narrative perspective is if the I intrudes upon it and they comment, like Milton does in Paradise Lost. Occasionally a voice comes in to the narrative and says, oh no, you know, oh Eve, in hapless hour, what have you done? Like as if he were one of the bystanders, but he can't help but lament what is just about to happen. He's so moved by it and disturbed by it, and of course we're supposed to be as well. But that doesn't mean that the authorial voice has been undermined by the narrator. It's just, or rather by the author, namely Milton. It reinforces and is directing the reader in how to respond here. And I don't think we get this in Tolstoy's account, but there's no I that intrudes upon the narrative. But so there's a sense of objectivity to it, and there's no reason to think other than this is how it is to be understood. Having said that, he will use all sorts of motifs and symbols for what happens that will make us aware of the artistic manner in which the story is told. So like the black bag, which is a funny old thing, but we're told that that's the experience of the character. Like he had a vision of a black bag and he's being forced down inside of it. What's the black bag? What does it represent? Is that Tolstoy's black bag, or is it the character who experiences it? It seems to be the character experiencing it. Or he's not saying it was as if Ivan was. He's saying Ivan had this dream in which he was being thrust into a black bag. Right? Objective. There's no distance from. So this is realistic narrative, in other words. There's no symbolism going on. It's not artificial. It does purport to be a realistic account of this. And so it is, in that sense, also, I think it's experientially vivid. So when we read it, we experience it in the same way that the characters do, without any need for, or even awareness that there's a difference between the protagonist, Ivan Ilych's experience, and the way we ought to be understanding it. We just take it as if it were our own experience. So it begins in the law courts with the announcement that Ivan Ilyich is dead, and then within a black margin was printed Praskovia Fyodorovna Golovin, that's his widow now, with heartfelt affliction informs friends and relatives of the decease of her beloved husband, member of the Court of Justice, Ivan Ilyich Golovin, who passed away on the 4th of February. The funeral will take place on Thursday at 1 o'clock. Now, these three names here are one of the reasons that Russian novels are so challenging, because this is typical in Russian as well for people to have three names. Your first name, your patronym, your father's name, and your own married name. But you'll have all three. And in addition to having three names, you can sometimes get nicknames. And the nicknames, or even your short name. So I have a friend in Russia, her name is Elena, Helen. Friends can call her Lena, which is just the short form, right? But it's more of a intimate name. She told me if I was angry with her in Russian, I could call her Lenorka. So there's ways of inflecting names to express something about your relation to her, and that's permissible within Russian. It's not permissible, it's common in Russian languages for names to have multiple variations on it. And that then, if you have a whole cast of characters, like in War and Peace, is really challenging at that point, particularly if you're not used to it. Like, who is this guy? He's being called this, and now he's being called that. Oh, it's the same guy. Okay. And yet this character is calling him this, and this character is calling him that. Well, that's because of the relation of that character to that character, and he's using the buddy name, and here this person's using the angry name. But right? So now you've just brought out a whole new dimension of the text, and we, the English reader, are reading it, and we think that a different person's being referred to. So that's really challenging. These are some of the, and so if you're a translator, how is that translated into English? How on earth do you do that? You can't just with a name. We can do, so my name's Scott, you can call me Scotty, right? If you're buddy, so there's a little, right? So you can put a Y on the end of anything, and it's sort of the diminutive, and it's like, right? Almost any of your names, you throw a Y on the end, it's the, you know, affectionate, it's actually the diminutive, it's the affectionate form, right? And some people's names have Y in them anyway, so then at that point, what do? Right? But if your name's Jonathan, you can be Johnny, right? Timothy or Timmy. Yeah, Zoe, I don't know what you do there. So that it doesn't work, but most names in English, that's how you do it. So you can, I'm just giving an illustration of how we can do that in English. It's just more common in Russia, and Russian is more of an inflected language, so nouns will be able to be inflected like that, just like verbs will be. So it's very rich, and the three names makes it even more problematic. So those things are challenging here. And she is the wife, and she is doing what she would do in the 19th century, announcing, because he's a public figure, but even if he wasn't, if she has means, announces in the papers that her husband is deceased, so that all who knew him and will mourn his passing will show up at this particular situation. So it's now a private event's been made public by publication. That's what publications do. They make public through publishing. Now, the comment from the narrator is Ivan Ilych was a colleague of the gentleman present, and all liked him. It was some weeks now since he had been taken ill. His illness had been said to be incurable. His post had been kept open for him, but it had been thought that in the case of his death, Alexeyev might receive his appointment, and either Vinnikov or Stabel would accede to Alexeyev's. So that on a hearing of Ivan Ilych's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen in the room was of the effect this death might have on the transfer or promotion of themselves or their friends. Okay, so what does the reader immediately conclude about the characters and their relation to Ivan Ilych? Is it a deep friendship? Is it? Yes?
They're all not really fighting over, but looking forward to the succession and to the promotion.
They're all looking for advancement.
Yeah.
And what Tolstoy is doing here is he and I'll tell you this right at the outset because it's pretty apparent actually, is he's making a social commentary. Social commentary on what happens in big cities in particular. Because they're in Moscow now, which is, by the way, is the imperial city, and you're not allowed to live in Moscow unless you have a permit. You're not allowed to be found there overnight unless you have a permit. You can work there, but then you have to leave. To this day. So I had friends in Moscow who worked at Moscow State University who lived outside the city, and they had to commute in to go to work, and then they had to leave at the end of the day. So it's, again, I say that to you because you would never know that otherwise, but there's a certain status that goes with that. Then it's obviously the capital of Russia, and this, remember, Russia in Tolstoy's day is the most backwards country in Europe as well. In terms, it's more medieval. It's a very feudalistic society. It's largely agrarian. People live in the land, off the land, and in the countryside. And it works, the aristocracy has a huge importance there in a way that it has not had in Western Europe for centuries. So the Enlightenment did not take place in Russia. Or where it did, the aristocrats adhered to it, but the peasants did not. So it didn't get passed on in any way. So Napoleon brought, in the War of 1812, he marched all the way to Moscow and brought with him and conquered large parts of the territory. Now, so the aristocrats end up learning French, and in most of Tolstoy's novels, like War and Peace, which is about the War of 1812, the aristocrats even speak French, and they do to this day in much of Europe, actually. It's the language of the educated, partly because of Napoleon. It's really odd and interesting. Yeah, question or different?
When did the Bolsheviks show up? 50 years after this?
I'm not sure about 50 years, but I'm not sure about the timing of the novel exactly. But yes, it's sometime after this. Communism is not even a thought at this stage. I'm not even sure. When is this written?
Well, it says his death was on, or his death was on 1882, but I don't know if that holds today.
It's in 1886 it was published. So by that point, I don't know about the Bolsheviks, but the Marxist Communist Manifesto has been published for sure. And it's thought and Marx is thinking about England, where he visited. He thought that that's where communism was going to take root, rather than where it did take root, which was in Soviet Russia. Well, it wasn't Soviet at that time, but in Russia. And he didn't dream that it was going to happen there. And the First World War had not happened. So this is 40 years, 80, 90, 40 years before that, almost before the Russian Revolution takes place. So the portrait here of the aristocrats, it really is a feudal society. So where there are those who are genuinely aristocrats, and then there's the nouveau riche, who are the wealthy or the upwardly mobile bourgeoisie types, like Ivan Ilych himself, who, because of his talents, is being drawn into the orbit of power, like will be the case throughout Moscow. So it's a means for advancement, social advancement, in the same way it is in Western Europe. Yes?
Can you repeat the term?
The bourgeoisie?
The first one.
Nouveau riche? The newly wealthy, who have got their money from their work. So the whole idea in our day of a meritocracy, people get into positions of power because they have worked their way there, because of their abilities. That is a new concept. In Europe, up to a certain stage, there is an inherited aristocracy. You get to the point of being in a high social rank because you've inherited a title and land and everything that goes with it. Not because you've earned it, but because you've inherited it. And then come the Enlightenment and industrialization in particular, there are means for the middle class to become wealthy, or if not wealthier than the aristocrats. And that creates new social dynamics. And it hasn't really happened in Russia yet, at least not very far. So it's still largely the aristocrats who are in control of the society, and the church along with them. So the church is, and in Russia, I will say further, in Eastern Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church is the state church, just like the Anglican Church is the church in England. In Russia, there is only one church. It's the Orthodox Church. Anything else, they wouldn't regard as the church at all. So the Catholics, they regard as meddlers. They don't belong here. Same with Protestants. They don't even know what to do with this, other than to persecute them as heretics, because there is only one Christianity, and it's the state church. Well, the state church is connected with the aristocrats as well. And there's a church-state relation issue there, but I don't want to get into that too much. But just to talk about the aristocracy, and so Ivan Ilych and all of these guys who are here, this is a means for the upwardly mobile and those who want to improve their lives. They're in the midst of Moscow. And Tolstoy, the Count, Count Leo Tolstoy is making a commentary on the character of these types of individuals, which he thinks is now changing Russian society, which it is. And what is the character? Well, they want to climb. That's it. They're social climbers. Now, this is and so there are two types of lives, I'm saying this right from the outset, that Tolstoy is going to compare or allow the reader to compare and contrast. On the one hand, there are those who he portrays it as artificially construct a life for themselves. And they understand the rules, and they follow them, but they relentlessly climb upwards. Now, Ivan Ilych is himself an example of this. But so is his wife, Praskovia, so is Peter, and so is almost everybody, well, in fact, everybody in the room here represents this sort of life. So they all live by the standards of this life, but it's an artificial life, and it is out of touch with reality. And in particular, the reality of the fact that they're going to die. It is a disturbing thought, which they don't want to think about. Let's not talk about death. Let's not think about death. Let's not think about mortality. Let's not think about the meaning of life. Let us accrue wealth and power. And that's the whole purpose of our life, is to do that. And above all, social rank. And the esteem of others around you. So they represent the one type of life. On the other hand, there is one figure that contradicts that, and his name is Gerasim. He's going to come into this as well. Gerasim. An odd figure. The name, to my mind, sounds like the madman in Jesus' story of the swine, the Gerasene demoniac, in whom he casts the demons. Remember, he's crazy because he's demon possessed, and he's naked, and he attacks everybody. Even when he's in chains, he breaks the chains, and he's a terror to everyone around him. And Jesus comes upon him and casts the demons in him into the pigs, and then the pigs go down and drown. That's not Gerasim, but that's the Gerasene demoniac. I'm not sure if it's A or E there. So from the vantage point, and then the question is, what's the relation between these two? I think from the vantage point of Ivan and Praskovia and Peter and everybody who's in the room there, this guy is crazy. He appears crazy to them. But Tolstoy thinks that he's the only one in his right mind. Because he lives life knowing that death is something that cannot be avoided, and is the way in which you approach your death will reveal whether you have an authentic life or just an artificial, socially constructed life. The one type, the people who are insane, the socially privileged, the wealthy, the social climbing, they will say what is authentic human existence. At least they determine it for themselves. Gerasim, who's not interested in social climbing, on the other hand, has no interest in this, and yet he can approach death and help others deal with death in a way that makes him Tolstoy's hero of sorts. So when I say hero, he is a very incongruous hero. He doesn't seem particularly heroic. He's socially ill-regarded, like Jesus. He does a lot of dirty work. He stays with people who are sick and ill and helps them, and does things that are menial tasks. And yet he is the one who is able to face death and help others to deal with death, including Ivan Ilych. But we're going to get there. The question I have here is, why does the novel begin with the death of the character? And then backtrack, because that's what it does. So it begins with that, and then it begins with his death in chapter 1. And then chapters 2 and onwards deal with the life of Ivan Ilych. And there's a backtracking. So the first 4 chapters, so there's this contraction of time and space that happens in this story, which I think is also in itself interesting. Same thing that happens in the gospel narratives. Remember that Jesus is born. We know about that, at least in Matthew and in Luke, we're told about the birth. Mark skips over it. He just gets right to John the Baptist, right? Proclaiming the way. And John's gospel starts before the worlds began. So very interesting. The beginnings of the gospels are all very, very different in some way. Even Matthew and Luke differ to some degree. But all of them have this, there's the first 30 years of Jesus' life is skipped over. They don't even talk about it. He starts his teaching ministry at the age of 30. What happened? I mean, there were 30 years of his life. Were they not important? Not for the purposes of the gospel, really. And so we're told about, so the sense of, so there's 30 years that pass unmentioned. Then there are the 3 years of teaching, which take a fair bit of time. We got a fair bit of Jesus teaching. But then the majority is dealing with the last week of his life. So there's this telescoping of time. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but there's a similarity there in the account here. So in the first 4 chapters, we've got 40 years of Ivan's life, the first 40 years. In the second 4 chapters, there's several months. So now it's the narrative time is expanding, while at the same time the years of his life are shrinking. And in the final 4 chapters, we've got about 4 weeks. So the majority of the time is spent at the end of his life. And the beginning of the novel, or the novella, because it's a short novel, is his death. So there's again a strong emphasis on how you end your life and how you approach it as being central to the story, which I think is, to some degree, there's something very Christian about the emphasis. Like, and I think now when I mean, around the room, we're all young here, with the exception of me. How are you going to live your life is a question you think about in certain terms, but are you thinking about it as a way, how are you going to prepare for your death? Because to some degree, that's what Tolstoy's story is encouraging us to do, is to think about how we're going to live our life in view of the reality and the imminence of our own death. And if you know you're going to die next week, how are you going to live your life now? Would it be different than if you thought your life was going to end in 60 years? And if so, why so? Because what Tolstoy's comment, and this is why I think it's such a powerful novel still, is the desire for advancement and progress in life remains the same. And the pressures to do so, to go along with the crowd. So you're here doing a bachelor's degree at Tyndale. Why are you doing that? You must wonder sometimes when you've got an essay to do, why am I doing this? I'm paying this much money. Why am I doing this? I'm not sure why I've ended up, why am I doing this? Have you thought about the meaning of life and what the end of your life is going to look like, and how are you preparing yourselves for that end, about which you don't know, by the way. You don't know when that's going to be. So there's an existential application to it, and this is why Russian literature, which tends to do this, is still so powerful. It's so contrary to the idea of progress. So it acquaints us with the reality of the impossibility of progress by human means. So you can change the conditions of life. You can get a smartphone in your pocket and you can fly around the world. But you're going to die more or less around the same age as your grandparents and great-grandparents did. And so you've made zero progress on that front. How then are you going to live your life in light of the reality and imminence of death? Because it's imminent. Whether that means 5 minutes or 5 years or 50 years, it's still imminent. Right? So that's really interesting. So the shrinking temporal framework and the shrinking spatial framework, because this is also what happens in the first 40 years, he's out in the countryside and he's moving around. He travels a lot like I did when I was young. So I went to Europe. I was in Europe for 12 years. I got my undergrad degree, and then I went over to Germany, and I traveled a fair bit around Europe and so forth, and then I went to England and did my PhD and all that sort of stuff. Okay, fine. And I did that until my mid-30s. It wasn't quite 40, but still a long time, very long time, not settling down. And then you get married, and then suddenly your life shrinks a little bit. You have kids, and then you get shrinks even more. You spend your life at home more because you're forced to do that. So life naturally pulls you backwards. And that's just the reality of it. And then you start to get old, and you're not very mobile then. And you end up spending how much of your life in the end of your life in a room, on a bed, sick. It's happening to you, by the way. It will come. Your grandparents, that's you. Think about your grandparents. If you see them in their limitations, there are advantages to it, by the way. There are also disadvantages. The disadvantage is clear because you can see it. The advantage, there are also clear advantages if they live their lives preparing for the imminence of death. But that's what the gospel is talking about, the importance of life and death and how you live your life in light of the reality of a thing that you cannot avoid. So it begins with him traveling around the countryside in the first 4 chapters, and then he ends up in the second 4 chapters. He is spending several months, and he's in Moscow now. In the last 4 weeks, he's stuck in a room. That's it, in pain. He doesn't leave it. In fact, he doesn't leave the couch. Can't get off it. How long does it seem? So, everyone in this room has been sick, I suspect. How long do the days seem when you're sick? Has the chronological time changed?
No.
Not one bit. How does it experience? Very long. On the other hand, I'll tell you this because, well, you experience it to a lesser degree. As you get older, every year goes by more quickly. Already, right? So when you're a year is a long time. Well, that's because it's, if you're 4, it's a quarter of your life. A year for me, at let's say I'm 40, is a tenth of that. Let's say I am 40, but I'm not. So experientially, it's not so, but it also, you repeat things over and over and over, and so a day goes, well, that was another day, and that was another day, and so you're rushing, it seems like you're speeding up, and then all of a sudden you get health kicks in, and then you slow down again. So all of that is, he's talking about the experience of space and time. That's what he's getting into, and that's what's really interesting about this, the way the novella is told. It's the experience of space and time, which is itself a philosophical issue, but it's certainly a human issue. The first philosopher that wrote on time and what it was Augustine, by the way, in his Confessions. It's not a problem for the Greeks, but Augustine talked about what time is and what it meant. But this is the experience of it. So as he gets older and as he's middle-aged, Ivan settles in Moscow. He gets an apartment. He gets ill, then he's confined to his study, and eventually he can't get off the sofa. And as he's there, who's with him at the end of his life? Because he spent his whole life, and most of us do this if we're men, and now more and more women, in the working world, you spend most of your time with your colleagues who here I work at Tyndale. I spend most of my time with students, but also my colleagues are doing the same thing that I'm doing, so I spend a lot of time with them. Some people live at work. If they're really ambitious, they work. They're workaholics because they want to get forward in life. At the end of their life, are their colleagues going to be with them at home? No, none of that. So again, the priority, so you're being pulled towards the things that are the most superficial. I'm not saying what I do here is superficial in any way, but there's an element of it pulling away from the natural family as a means of progress. So it's commentary to some degree on the Enlightenment and its idea of progress through work. And it's a critique of it. So the time and the space contract to the point of zero, where there is no more time and there's no more space. He dies. And that's expressed in the way the story is told. So you have the sense that the first 40 years go by very quickly, because they take the exact same time as the next 4 chapters, which is several months, and then 4 weeks, the final 4 chapters. And so when he dies, there is a sort of single moment in which he passes from mortality and the limitations of space, which everyone experiences, to eternity. He's translated into the eternal realm, about which, and how does that relate to the black bag then? Which he feels like he's getting pushed down into and doesn't want to go, and at the same time wants to go into. Odd discrepancy there. Yes?
You're assuming kind of is the idea that the authentic life, or if you're looking for advancement or superficial things, then when you come to death, you're always going to have to reconcile with the authentic portion of your life.
Well, the authentic portion, or the natural portion, or the one connected to your own mortality, your body, your home, your family, is the one that they spend their whole life running away from, denying, and saying is unimportant. And that's what we see right at the outset. We have a bunch of lawyers sitting in the room, and somebody dies, and we're told that they like him. But they're now obsessed, or their real heart is revealed in what they think about his death, which is not, I'm going to miss him, but where does this leave me? There's a self-absorption, and at the same time a self-delusion about the meaning of life in them. And it's presented ever so subtly, without even a hint of negative commentary by Tolstoy. But that's what makes it so powerful. So there is, to some degree, we can see that there's a heavy irony in the depiction, without it being using the figure that we would call irony. It's more the tone that's ironic. But there's no doubt, by the world standards, the people in that room are considered to be the most important people. They have the wealth, they have the privilege, they have the power, all of which are talked about in our day. You know, we live in an unjust society because we don't have access to power, privilege, and whatever. Right? The social justice thing. My response to that response is that really what life is about, those things? Or are you really complaining that you're not like those people? Are those people really that happy because they have material wealth? And is that really all that? Anyway. Yes?
I almost think that the black bag almost like symbolizes death. So when you get stuffed into a bag, you're like depleted of oxygen.
It certainly does. I think it symbolizes death. But it's not only death, it's partly the meaning of death and what you expect, because death happens. But death is something that needs to, what is death?
Lack of life.
Yeah, a lack of life. So on the one level, that's clear. They are opposites, right? So if you're dead, you're not alive. And if you're alive, you're not dead. So one explains the other, but it still doesn't say what it is unto itself. What does that mean? If you have an eternal soul,
It's your physical body.
I usually actually die.
yeah, what dies exactly? And what does the death mean? For them, it's death as in it's the loss of everything that they've lived for. There's no doubt about that. So they don't even want to talk about death. The idea of being sick again is they're offended by it. Their sense of divinity is offended by the idea that they could die. So they don't want to talk about that. But then when they face it, okay, well now what is it going to mean? Well, it means that they are not as they've lived their lives. They are not immortal. They've lived as if they were. Now they're not. So when Ivan dies, how do the rest of the characters respond? Do they think about death for the first time and change their lives? Or do they just carry on? Because if they did, they've learned nothing from it, other than that they want to avoid it. But we already knew that, in which case they're shallow and superficial and ridiculous. But this is more than a social critique. It's presenting something more powerful than a social critique. It is presenting a social critique. So it's a critique of bourgeois society, to use the Marxist. Yeah, it's the middle class grasping after wealth and status and social advancement. And that's the middle class. Because remember, the aristocrats have their position by inheritance. They've inherited their wealth. They've inherited their station in life. In Russia, they've inherited a title. They're the landed aristocracy. Whereas the middle class, and then there's the poor. They're not advancing at all because they're poor. They do what they do. They live off the land. And they are, to some degree, content with their lives because that's the way life is, and they never think about anything other than that. But then there's this group in the middle, and the size of the group varies from culture to culture, but that group is the one for whom their position can get better or it can get worse. And come the Enlightenment and the imposition of rationality and order on society for the sake of advancement, that group of people gets caught up in the rat race of self-improvement without ever once asking the question what the purpose and meaning of work is. Because remember, if you think back at, and I talked about this in earlier classes, in Genesis 1, Adam and Eve, the first thing they're told to do after we're told they're in the image of God, they're told to be fruitful and multiply, and then they're to work. Right? Subdue the earth, bring it under your dominion, and they're supposed to make the world into a big garden, so to cultivate it. It's called the cultural mandate. That's what theologians call it, by the way. The cultural mandate. So they're to improve things that are already good, because God's called them good, through their work, their labor. And that includes themselves, their minds, their understanding of the world. And so Adam names the animals. That's partly him using an intellectual labor. He's calling them by their right names. He understands what they are. This is actually an illustration of cultivation, I would say. And note that what's implicit in that text, and it's only implicit, it's not explicit, is that they are doing what God does, namely work. God works. And then on the seventh day, he rests. Talking about the meaning of work, and it's talking about the meaning of rest. And it's about imitating what God did. They're in the image and likeness of God. They're doing what God did. There's an importance to work. There's an importance to rest. But work is not a bad thing. But its meaning is derived from how they relate to God. These folks don't think about God. They don't talk about God. And their work is for their self-advancement their self-glorification and their self-autonomy, really. It's not a word, but their autonomy, they're as if they could be laws unto themselves. This word autonomy is one, which is one of the key phrases of the Enlightenment. I talked about it in conjunction with Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? He talks about the Enlightenment is the throwing off the tutelage of the past. Daring to know, not accepting things on, but knowing it for yourself, doing it for yourself, this postulate of autonomy. These are all characters trying to be autonomous, be laws unto themselves. To be like gods, in other words, which is the curse of sin in Genesis 3, by the way, is that they, to some degree, achieve that. They act as if they could be little gods. So that's what this society is like, and Tolstoy is questioning how valid this life is. Remember, he's Count Leo. He will eventually go and live with the peasants. I'm talking about his own biography now, and live off the land like a farmer, which is itself interesting again. Comments or questions there? Again.
Could the black bag, I'm not sure if this is a stretch.
You want to get back to the black bag? Good.
Could it symbolize like wealth as well? Because usually you put money in the black bag. So someone would be saying that like, well, to pursue wealth is death? Because why a black bag?
That is a good question. Like as a symbol of death, it seems like a strange sort of one. Other than the blackness.
Yeah.
Like black, you would say.
Body bag.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
a
it's-
body bag.
Right. I don't know if they have body bags that back then, as we would call them, but you would think of death as a blackness, because you close your eyes and you think sleep is, you close your eyes and you don't see anything, and you think death's like sleep, and so you associate it with darkness, right? As opposed to light when your eyes are open during the day and you sleep at night, and so there are all these associations of death with black. Okay, but the bag, that doesn't fit. Like, what's with the bag? Because that's it, you're right, that seems really odd, and it does seem, to some degree, it's something you put stuff into, if not money, then stuff. So materialism, a life lived for materialism, maybe. Sort of? Yes?
Do you know what the black bag?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay,
No,
so
I
it's
don't know.
okay.
I mean, I know sometimes I
didn't know
talk
if
and
you
I
were
ask questions and I know the answer to the question. I don't know what it means, but it because it's a symbol.
Anybody know?
Well, it's a symbol, right? It's a symbol of something, and symbols are figures of speech, and they symbolize something. What do they symbolize? And I think there's a complexity to it. If it were, you could say it's this, then it wouldn't be a symbol anymore. Yes.
So I'm gonna try and do that.
You're going to try and explain what the symbol is.
Yeah. So
Well, okay. I mean, I think that it begs. I mean, there's no way you cannot try and. He wants you to try and understand what that thing is.
Yeah.
So go ahead. What do you think it is?
The transfer, like if it's about that, it could be the transfer of responsibility of making the choice between a superficial and an authentic life for his successors and his kids and his servants.
Well, there's that, but then there are other things about the black bag. So at the bottom of it, he doesn't want to go into it, first of all. So there's the bag, and then there's his relation to the bag. We're going to have to spend a lot of time on the bag. Because he doesn't want to go down into it, and he's getting pushed down into it. And then, he has the experience twice. First time, he does not want to go down into it, and he's going to go anyway. Why doesn't he want to go? Second time, he gets to the point where he accepts it and is willing, and then he sees a little light. There's light at the end of the black bag, light at the end of the tunnel, if you will.
What?
No?
Yeah.
It's not a tunnel, but there's a light there, right?
Yeah.
It's part of a dream thing. Well, like, what does it symbolize? It's really interesting. And dreams need to be interpreted. And I'm not Joseph. But he had the same dilemma, right? So there's the 7 fat cows and then the 7 lean cows and the 7 fat pieces of grain and then the 7 lean grains, and they swallow them up, and it's happened twice, so that it's going to happen. That's what happens in biblical dreams. When it happens the second time, it's imminent. And it's true. It's for sure. It didn't just happen once. It's now confirmed in a different way. It's the same dream, saying the same thing. They're going to be, why 7? Because there's 7 years. It'll be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And it's sure, absolutely certain. There's no doubt about it. That's the meaning of that dream. He interprets it. What's the black bag? That's a little less mysterious because he's already given us context, the context of death. So black bag, everybody in the room knows that, and it's at the end of his life, everyone knows that the black bag is connected with death. There's no dispute about that. Whereas the 7 grains and the 7 cows, you wouldn't immediately come to that until you read to the end of the Joseph story, at which point then it is obvious. But right away there, whereas this we know because death is the story, the beginning of the story. So we know he's going to die as well because the character that is the main protagonist is Ivan, and we've already seen he's dead. So the black bag, which he doesn't want to go into, is death. It's bad in the sense that in one sense it's bad, and in another sense it's not so bad. So the first time he's getting pushed down into it, he only sees it as bad. Why? Because his life has never been lived
the way he wanted it.
No, it was exactly the way he wanted it, but it had nothing. Death was not part of that picture.
Maybe he didn't see death the way he wanted to, and then Jerison showed him the light at the end of it.
He taught him how to approach his death.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my sense, is that he has experienced something. But we'll look at the text more closely. I'm going to do that next class. This class was a sort of an overview, big picture. We'll next class go into it in not granular detail, but finer detail, and see how it works, because the way in which the story is told is important. Yes?
So, this seems kind of like a different interpretation or a different reaction to the Enlightenment than kind of what we got in the poetry.
For sure.
So, how did...
And when you say the poetry, what are you talking about here?
Like
Wordsworth?
Yeah, like Wordsworth and
the Romantic movement.
We just finished going over it. But it seems like it semi has some of the same elements. Like, even the author himself, he goes back to living on the land. Like, he goes into...
You're right.
But, like, in the actual text, like, there's this idea of we want to avoid this fake constructed life. And
which Wordsworth would agree with, and
yes.
the Romantics in general.
But his goal is not necessarily that everyone go run off to the forest, but like
back to nature.
Back to the reason why we're doing it. Like it seems to have the same.
So this is a fascinating observation, and I agree. There's a real similarity and there's a real difference there. At least it seems to me. The Romantics, for all of their appeal to go back to nature, and their dislike of reasoning and abstract reasoning and reasoning that, to use Wordsworth's phrase, murders to dissect. So in order to take things apart and see how they work, it kills things and then pulls them apart. So literally they're dissecting animals, they're opening them up, having a look at them, see what's inside, see how everything functions. That's happening in the Enlightenment. And taxonomy, you can with a little pen, you can take a bulletin board and you can pin every living creature that you can imagine. You go through a museum, like the ROM used to be like this, it's a little less like this now, but every different type of creature that lived, you'd have a pin through it stuck to the board. If it was small enough, it got big, right? Like every type of butterfly, so look at all the variation there. That's taxonomy, and then they want to order them. And that's a way of understanding everything. There's that approach of the Enlightenment. The Romantics say, yeah, but what you've missed there is life. Yeah, you've got the various forms of life, but the essence of life you've missed. Mm-hmm. And that's the most important bit. So there's a supernatural element in nature that you're totally missing. but they deal with the problem of the Enlightenment because they don't get rid of the idea of progress. It's that the progress continues through the poetry and through the mystic imagination, through the belief in the creative, imaginary powers of the human race. So it's not a total repudiation of the Enlightenment. It's pursuing it through different means, rather than rationality, through irrationality, if you will. Right? The Enlightenment, I said to you, has a prejudice against prejudice. Which we carry to this very day. Part of our progressive culture, which has never left the Enlightenment. We think prejudices are, because they're prejudices, wrong. We want to progress beyond prejudgments. What are we progressing towards? They have nothing there. It's the romantic response is, but that takes us away from nature, this prejudice, because to be in nature is to have natural responses. So they try and supernaturalize our connection to nature, and they create a new religion out of it, more or less, which I call panentheism, which is God is in all things. Tolstoy doesn't do that. It's a more radical critique of the Enlightenment than that, I think. So he just rejects it. It's not that we are going to, and he's a poet, and he's clearly thinking that writing is important, but he doesn't seek to perpetuate the aims of the Enlightenment through poetry or through mysticism. It's by promoting a life that is opposed to this superficial rationalism that the West follows. You wanted to speak.
So
You're tracking thinking, and you're thinking, by the way, this is good, this is what I want.
what is, like, in, I guess, a synthesized version, what does he want? He wants people to work and
Tolstoy's answer seems to be to stick with medievalist sort of agrarian life, the simple life, the life lived off the land, the dignity of work. Not pursuing power as an end, because these folks are pursuing power as an end, and being intensely suspicious to it. So Tolstoy in some ways is a lot like Tolkien, highly suspicious of the signs of progress and the means of progress, and even what they call progress. He's a radical critic of it. He thinks progress is an atrocity. It's not a progress at all. It's a devastation of nature. So what you call progress, I see as the wiping out of the natural world and the wiping out of human nature and the human family to start with a blank slate, and then you create something artificial which you say is going to be better. There's a sharp critique of that in Tolkien, and also I'd say in Tolstoy, so in this novella for sure. This one's more profoundly connected with, in a sort of an existential way, with the meaning of life and death, which in some ways is more profound than Tolkien's take on it.
It's like a sense of loss of vision, or what is your vision on? Like, are your glasses blurry and you're seeing it in a disillusioned way? And I think he can see beyond that. He's trying to develop that in others.
Yeah, so for all the pointy-head smart people who work in offices in Moscow or Toronto or universities, these people are the dumbest people you'll ever meet, because they're totally detached from life, and they don't know what life means. They get wealthy and they get powerful and they get puffed up, and they are terrified of death, and they are not prepared for death, and they let their families break, and they break themselves, and they do it in order to work. And the purpose of life is to work, and then when the work ends, they've got nothing left. Like, these are what the definition of stupid people. Not smart people, but these are the smart people. So it's a critique of the Enlightenment and the idea of progress, which I say is a pointy-headed, I'm not very pointy-headed, but you know, it's a figure of speech.
But at the same time, within his kind of ideal model, people would still be able to have those same jobs and do that same work. It's about their perspective and their values.
It's more the perspective that he's most critiquing. It's not so much the urban versus rural, although almost invariably it ends up being that way. But you're right, it's not so much the fact that they are in the city. You just said this is what the city's like, but it isn't really about cities. It's more about what leads people to the cities and the type of life that's lived in the cities. And the bigger question is the life issue. How do you regard your life? Is it possible in a city to have the attitude of Gerasim? And that's really the question is it possible to live like a Christian in the midst of a culture whose way of life is really a denial of everything about the gospel, which is how you view your life and how you view your death, and how you work that out in your life, not just in your life and your death, but also in your work. What's the purpose of your work? Because that's the difference. They think the purpose of their work is to ascend the social ladder. Jesus' kingdom is given to you. Like when you put your faith and trust in Christ, you are given a new nature. You're born again. You're part of the kingdom of God, which is broken into the world, and you live in the light of that kingdom. Well, does that mean you act exactly the same way as everybody else? If it does, then you probably haven't understood much about the kingdom of God. So it's about that as well. Gerasim has understood that the kingdom of God is to be lived in the midst of the city of this world, which is Babylon the Great, if you will. So if you want to see it in the bigger perspective. So it's not about nature versus city, it's about two cities. Which city do you belong to? Right? Because Gerasim's not living out in the countryside, he's living in the city.
Oh, and he's still like doing all these good things.
He's doing menial labor. He acts as like, he helps Ivan when he's dying. He's his nursemaid. He's closer to him than his wife, who's married to him but wants to, like when he's screaming in his door, she said it was so loud and it was so unbearable, I could hear it through 3 closed doors, which is quite funny in some ways. Say, oh, so you really were really choked up about your poor husband. You closed 3 doors so you wouldn't have to hear it. Why did she have this attitude towards him? Because it's clearly an indictment on her, but we're going to find Ivan treated her the same way. He married her because he thought she would advance him. She had cultural connections. She was a socially elite, right? That's why he married her. The fact that she was pretty was also part of the allure, but not because she was pretty, but because, again, it makes them look good. It's the trophy wife, right? Yes.
So which one of these sides, like the enlightened side or the Gerasim side, would value legacy?
I'm not sure that comes up in the novel per se, because the legacy. So the Enlightenment side acts like a disinherited landlord, as if we have no inheritance, because we don't live to pass on things. We live for ourselves, and then die. But there's no sense of I'm going to leave the world better than I came into it, and I'm going to pass on to my children something of the benefits of my life.
Even though that's what's happening.
It might be what's happening. But is that why people live? I'm not saying everybody, but the world in general, the purpose of life is to have the most toys when you die. And then if it gets passed on to your kids, well, that's okay, but that's a sort of afterthought.
So do you think that on the other side of that, living this, a menial life, just doing your work, living how you should, I suppose, is there any legacy to that, or is that not an element?
Well, if it's in the kingdom of God, if it's done for God, then the question of how you live your life now will also relate to how you live your life after death. Because both, this is Christian doctrine and this is Tolstoy adhering it to, there is life after death. And the one that denied God in this life will also deny God after death. And will have nothing to show for it for all the wealth in this life. Like, look at the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man who was very rich had all these things, and he's separated by a great gulf from Abraham. There's a gulf that they cannot cross, and he's burning. Right? Whereas Lazarus, he whom God helps, was poor as can be. Even the dogs are licking his sores, an unclean animal. He has a name. And the poor man, he who trusted in God and didn't receive any of the benefits, he now lives a very different life after death. So Gerasim, who lives in the knowledge of the life that comes after death, is being very intelligent in his choices about how he lives this life. It's not right, because if you live it like it all is gone when you die, and that's the end of it, then you've not understood that there will be a life to come after death. And how is that going to be lived? Whereas if you have been aware of that, no, you can't take it all with you, and God's kingdom is the thing that you're investing in, which Gerasim is, because otherwise he wouldn't sacrifice himself, because it is self-sacrificing love, there's no doubt about it. He's getting very little pay for it. He's socially looked down upon. He's not advancing himself at all. He not only finds meaning in his own work, he's already finding it meaningful work. He also knows that the meaning he finds in the work will not disappear when he himself departs this mortal life. It will remain meaningful because he did it for Jesus. Now, it doesn't say that in the text, so there's no explicit theological statement here. It's more about life and death in an existential way. But I say it's compatible in many ways with Christian thinking, but it's not explicitly so. But I just don't think, if it's not Christian, where does it even get the ideas that life means things like this? Because it's not a pagan idea. It's simply not. This is a legacy of Christianity, even if it's not gone all the way there in being explicit. Other comments, questions. The other thing is there is an inner life and an outer life. The outer life is the life that everyone else can see, and then there's the life that goes on inside characters. So it's not only the contrast between Gerasim and then all the other characters, there's also a life within a character as well as the life the character lives outside the character, just like you all have lives inside the confines of your own heads. I have no idea what other people are thinking any more than you have any idea what I'm thinking if I'm not saying it. But that life goes on all the same. You wake up and you're thinking, and you can think, and you can think about all manner of things. That life is a real life because it's you that's doing that thinking. And that life can diverge from the life you're living in the midst of others, so you can be a hypocrite. That's one option. Gerasim is not a hypocrite. So they're hypocrites because they appear to like one another and to be living in harmony with one another, when inside we see right at the outset that when he dies, they're thinking about their own self-advancement. That's what's going on in their heads. So that's what they're really thinking. So they are hypocrites. Hypocrites never get a good account in literature. They're not authentic, whereas Gerasim is authentic. The way he lives and the way he acts have integrity. And there's no doubt that Gerasim is Tolstoy's hero in this little story. But then if you think about it, and let me conclude with this because we're towards the end anyway. No, we got a few minutes. The reader who's reading this, how is the reader supposed to respond to the story? Because it is a story, but how is the audience supposed to take this story, and what are they supposed to do with it? It's not for the purpose of entertainment, by the way. Let me talk about that. That's a good way to conclude. Russians find the idea of literature as entertainment repugnant. Disgusting, disgraceful. Like you watch it to be, how you went to a show. Just think about the word show. It's a display, it's a superficial thing. There's nothing deep, there's nothing meaningful. It's a show where, it was funny, it was entertaining, it was a good use of my 2 hours time, it was worth the money I spent for it, whatever. did it challenge you? Did it speak to your life? Did it change your life? Did it give meaning to your life? Was it beautiful? Was it good? Was it true? Was it just? Did it in any way advance it? Those are the questions they're going to ask. This novella touches on those sorts of things. Those are the deep questions. Entertainment just touches on the surface. And you can sell entertainment, and you can commodify it, and you can repeat it. I mean, the Disney franchise is proof of it, with ever diminishing returns. Or pop music, which is the same song over and over. I love you, why don't you love me? No, I really, really do, and you really, really don't, and this is terrible, so I'm going to sing about that. I mean, there are about 3 or 4 different storylines for a pop song. Over and over, different types of music, some, whatever your taste of it is, but it's the same garbage, recycled. It's not dealing with the truth. It's not, and mostly it's about sex. It's not even about love. So the most superficial way, well, that's the product of a culture that lives like the culture that Tolstoy is asking us to question, which is our culture. But he's saying it to the Russian people. He's not writing for us. I just think it applies to us. But he's writing it for the Russians and saying, don't make the progress and go down that terrible rabbit trail that the Western Enlightenment figures are going and lose all meaning to life. And the result of that is that Russia, to this day, is rather backwards in many ways, but they're quite a profound, deep people, I've found. And I'm deeply troubled as well, but in terms of the literature, the art, so think about ballet and think about the literature and think about the music, there's a substance to it which is engaging on profound levels. And that is why I think he's still worth reading, why people still read Tolstoy, and why you probably found him to be more profound than anything we've read thus far. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'll see you next class.